Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Research Community Manager for Sage Methods-Based, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Julianne Cheek and Elise Obi, who are co-authors of this book on research design. And we're talking about each chapter in the book, and today we're going to be focusing on Chapter 3. We encourage you to take a look at all of those recordings to get a sense of kind of all the different aspects of research design. So to begin with, why don't you just briefly introduce yourselves, and then we'll talk about Chapter 3.
Well, hi, my name is Julianne Cheek. I'm a professor at a university college in Norway, Østfold University College in Norway, where I've taught master's students research design for many years, and the book developed out of that teaching and teaching that went before that, obviously. And we learn a lot from our students, and we think that people can learn a lot from the book, hopefully.
And I'm Elise Obi. I used to work with Julianne at Østfold University College. Now I'm at Kristiania University College, also in Norway.
I think when we have taught research, we get a sense of the dilemmas that new researchers have, whether they're students or researchers who are trying to learn a different approach. And so one of the areas we're going to talk about that relates to your Chapter 3 is the difference between a research area, a research problem, and a research question. So do you want to begin by differentiating between those terms that all sound kind of the same, but they aren't?
Lisa, do you want to kick this one off this time?
Yes. As we describe this in the book, and we are aware that there are different ways of explaining this, but we explain this as the research area is the broad topic, like the wide area that you're interested in. And that could be like, for example, long-term unemployment or something like really huge that has some form of significance on society. And the research problem refers to a smaller part of that big area that you want to focus on. And the research question refers to a very specific aspect of the area or the problem that you want to actually focus on, and the very specific aspects you want to learn more about. Yeah.
Yeah. So really the difference between them, Janet, as Elisa has indicated, it's really level of focus. Okay, both breadth and depth, and going from the area to the problem to the specific research questions, which may take different forms, as we'll see later on, okay, is part of designing research. It's part of that iterative thinking where we start with our area, we refine it, we think, what's the problem we're interested in? What is it about that area that's triggering our interest? And what specifically are we going to study about it, taking in mind the time we have, the resources we have, and the priorities that we have for whatever applications we want to make out of the research that we do.
So do you have an example, maybe, Julianne, of these three levels of focus?
Yeah, well, I was involved in a study that was looking at a major health issue, and that is the issue of when an older person's living independently in their private home, they fall over and, for example, break their hip, fractured neck of femur. They're taken to hospital and then they can't go home after that. They have to go into a nursing home. This is one of what we call a health transition. It's usually a one-way transition in terms of not being able to go back home. And we wanted to understand more about how that transition works for a variety of reasons. One is that it has a huge social and economic cost to society. Both of those, by the way, are part of a big area. And so then you would need to work out, are you interested in social or economic costs or both or whatever? And also we knew that we didn't know much about what families and the person making the move were going through. There wasn't much about their personal experiences of the move. So that was sort of the broad area we were interested in. So the problem really that we focused on was we don't know much about how people are experiencing the move. We brought it down to this is transition, it's an issue. What is it that we want to know about? We want to know about how people and their families experience, do, perceive that move and what happens as a result of that. And consequently, we brought it down and we had a number of questions that we wanted to explore with family members or significant others and the older person about the move. So we started off with the area of the big health transition area of this particular transition. Focus being we don't know much about what's actually going on in this transition. We know what the transition is. We know the medical diagnoses. We know the care factors. We know the policies. We know those things, but we don't know much about that human level questions derived from that, getting at that human perceptions and experiences, etc., coming down, making research questions out of them.
I think it's a really good example because for those who are watching this, whatever your own field might be, you could think, well, with that broad research area, there you could be studying that from a business perspective. You could be studying it from an education perspective. What kind of caregivers do we need? What kind of training do staff need to handle this? You know, what kinds of social services are needed? That could be very kind of large scale. You know, you could take it down to the organizational level, you know, and look at, you know, how, you know, what kinds of organizations serve people who are either receiving care at home or receiving care in a facility, or going down, as you described, to that individual level. So what's the personal experience of the people who are actually going through this? So you could think of, there are, you know, hundreds of research questions that you could derive from that broad research area, and lots of problems you can inquire about. So I think, you know, for most students and new researchers, the comment you will most commonly hear is focus, focus, focus. And this is what they're talking about. Take it from that big kind of broad area that intrigues you down to something that you can study. And then you start to say, well, you know, what kind of approach, you know, would best fit that. So, you know, then, you know, the next thing to think about is, you know, really refining further. Now, you know, we've already, with this example, determined, well, we're interested in the human individual experience. So then within that, you know, how to refine the questions so that you can gain some credible answers that are going to help to inform the field. So, you know, why don't you talk a little bit about that? What, you know, how can someone go from thinking about the big areas of issues and problems and concerns down to specific problems, down to specific questions?
Well, that depends on the type of information that you're trying to find out, or the type of knowledge that you want as a result of your research. For example, in the project I talked about, we wanted to know about people's perceptions and experiences. So we wanted them, we asked very open questions because we wanted them to tell us what were the key things from their point of view about perceptions and experiences. And that led itself to a certain type of approach that we talk about in the book, and we will be talking about in the next 3 or 4 podcasts after this, qualitative approaches to research, where the aim is to allow the answers to emerge from the answers that people give, the issues, etc., etc. But Elisa has also got examples, I think, from your research box, okay, your research toolbox, of where it's a different type of research question that's needed because it's a different type of research approach that's required to answer the research question. Did you want to talk a bit about that at this stage?
Yes, if we go back to the area that I just mentioned before, if you're interested in long-term unemployment, then that could be whatever related to long-term unemployment. But say that you decide that what you're you narrow your focus to why people who want to work are not able to get a job.
Mm.
And then you will have to focus even more, because what do you mean? What exactly is it you want to know related to that more narrow focus? And then maybe you work with the literature, you read something, you look at other people's research, and then you discover that there is reason to believe that people who've never had a job struggle more to get a job compared to those long-term unemployed people who do have work experience. And then if you have that reason to believe something related to long-term unemployment, then you can design a type quantitative study to test a specific hypothesis. You can test an assumption
Mhm.
about certain variables. And in this case, it would be the assumptions that people who've never had a job will struggle more to get a job than those who have had a job before. And that's a specific assumption. And then you would need a totally different design
Mhm.
to actually go out and test that assumption. And then that focus will require a very different type of study, a very different type of data collection. And that would be a totally different study from the qualitative studies that Julianne talked about.
Mhm.
And it's a reason why you very rarely see hypothesis used in a qualitative study, because the qualitative study is more open and working more what we call inductively, developing information from the ground up. Whereas the hypothesis is a type of way of structuring a research question, correct, Elisa? That's what you're
Yes,
sort of saying there. Yeah.
it's one way to structure a research question, but it's not the only way to structure a research question. And if you do use a hypothesis, then you have a very specific way of formulating your research questions, and that requires specific types of design.
Mm. So going right back to your original question, Janet, which we've traveled a wide path covering many aspects of,
Mhm.
the area problem question levels are focusing levels, and they're very important because, like Elisa's saying, and what we're trying to point out in the book in chapter 3 and then building on it in the rest of the chapters that follow, is what type of question you come up with will determine how you are going to do that study. And the type of question that you come up with is determined by what you want to know about, what type of knowledge do you want. So if the type of knowledge you want is a deductive one where you can predict the effects of certain things or whatever, certain variables of interest, as Elisa says, it's hypothesis driven. If the type of knowledge you want is about people's perceptions and experiences of which we cannot predict because we don't know much about it at all, and we need to explore more, exploratory description, wanting thick description, then we need to ask the type of questions that will enable it. And that's the semi-structured or open type of question that's associated with more qualitative approaches.
So in either one of these options, the hypothesis deductive style or the more qualitative inductive style, literature plays a role in understanding the area of research and the problems and how people have studied them. Talk a little bit about how the role of the literature in either of those options.
Well, I'll kick off, Elisa, if you want,
Yep.
and you can add in. Well, in our last podcast, or actually in the first podcast, where we were talking about literature and what it is in a research design, people sometimes think they do a literature research and what they look at is all the empirical work that's been done in the area. That's very important and it's essential, yes. But they forget that there's another whole lot of literature that's often overlooked that's equally important, and that is literature about ways of researching, methods, methodology. And this includes ways that questions can be formed, ways to develop the questions, hypothesis, principles of hypothesis development and testing and so forth. So it is absolutely essential that the literature is used in that way. The methodological and method-related literature is used to back up and justify and provide credibility to the type of question that's developed and the type of approach that's developed attached to that. For me, this is often overlooked by students. They tell me, I'm going to come in and I'm going to do some interviews. And then I say, yes, now tell me more. Oh, well, I'm going to do some interviews. Okay. And what I know then is they haven't read anything at all about interviews. And there are lots of different ways you can interview. There are lots of different types of questions in interviews. It can be a quantitative study using interviews. It can be a qualitative study using interviews. Again, unless you have all the pieces together, unless you've done your homework in the literature, you are going to struggle with this because there is a whole literature about that. Elisa, did you want to add anything to that?
I think this relates to feasibility too. Like you talked about in the last episode, Julianne, when you talked about ethics, that it's really important that you have feasibility in mind when you design your research. So, for example, if you design a quantitative study to test the hypothesis, you would have to know your methodology. You would have to know the method that you need to actually be able to test that specific hypothesis. And you will need to know how many people you would need data from. You will need to know exactly what statistical analysis procedures you need to do to be able to test that specific hypothesis. And you need to know that, because if you don't, you might end up in a situation where, well, I have this really interesting hypothesis and I have my design, but then you realize that you don't have access to enough potential respondents to actually give you the data that will provide credible conclusions from the testing that you do on that hypothesis. And then the design can be good, but if you don't know exactly what it takes to test it, it isn't feasible. And then you would have to work more on your design and maybe your hypothesis or your research question.
Right. And if you're a student or new researcher, those kinds of having to retrace your steps and like do something over again, that's going to prolong your time in that stage of the research that has, its own costs. Going back to, just to focus a little bit about methodological literature, which I think will be very useful to our viewers for this interview or discussion. I think, when we look at journal articles, and there are journals that are focused specifically on methodologies and methods. So you can look for those. There are journals that focus on mixed methods, or journals that focus on statistics and different kinds of evaluation. And there are methods-focused journals in qualitative research. But generally, in a research article, there is only so much kind of space to go into the details. And I know when I was a doctoral student, I would be going like, okay, you described what you did, but how did you do it? Like, how can I do this? And that's where texts like your research design book we're discussing here and other books are really valuable. And I think, as you're trying to evaluate, what kinds of methodological sources are going to help me to really make sense of, the kinds of points we were making here, you might be going like, okay, how do I do that? How do I really work through that? Look for the texts that are, by methodologists that specialize, in the area that you're, looking to design. Some methodological texts are more of an overview that are going to help you sort through. So you look at that and it weighs different options, qualitative, quantitative, what the different options are. Then once you have selected that, then, go more deeply, by looking for the sources that really focus on that particular area. So, if you're talking about interviews, well, there are entire books about interviews, and, that will talk about, the very practical aspect of those.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is really important. And I think what you've really set up well for is like chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of the book, because really what the rest of the book is about is unpacking exactly what you've said. Because this is it. Students get to the point where, or early research, or even experienced researchers, myself, I've got to the point where I know what I want to do, etc. And then all of a sudden I thought, oh, but who's done that? How have they done it? What have they done? What can I trust? What can't I trust? And as Elisa says, so if I'm doing a large scale survey, what sort of numbers am I might not have exact numbers, but what range of numbers might I be looking at? And in qualitative research, as we'll find out when we get into some future podcasts, how am I going to work out how many people I need when it's impossible to give a number at the start of the study? How do you navigate things like that? How do you front up to those things and work out a way forward that still enables your research to have credibility? And the other thing that also you need to read up as well is, like, if you're going to collect, if you know what information you're going to collect about it, you need to also start thinking about how you will analyze that information, and whether or not, as Elisa said, that analysis will enable you, with that analysis of that information will enable you to answer that particular question. And putting it, when you're developing your questions, it's not just developing your questions, you are beginning to develop this whole conceptual circle that we had with the double arrows, with all the things sitting around it, where you will go backwards and forwards in your thinking iteratively until you have landed your question, until you have then worked out all the things that go with it. And just having said to you about landing the question, in our chapter, we give an example written by 2 former PhD students about the struggle of developing their research questions. And it's actually a fantastic self-reflexive piece by these 2 scholars, where they hang it all out there for us to see, right? This was where I started. I ended up over here. I had no idea where I was going at times, and this is how I got from A to B via maybe D, E, F. And I thoroughly recommend those pieces of reflexive writing for people who are struggling or feel that they're the only ones that have this problem. I don't think, as you say, Janet, we don't have a place for this type of writing that's easily accessible. It's a huge oversight, and learning from other people's experiences is very important. So we tried to do that as much as possible throughout the chapters in the book.
Those kinds of stories are so valuable, because we read a scholarly article, which is not to say, to denigrate the value of a scholarly article, but when we're trying to learn how to do it, we look at them, we're thinking, wow, that was smooth sailing, and like everything went just exactly right. And you don't know, what that person went through, or what that team went through to accomplish that study. So the kinds of examples that you described from chapter 3 of your book, to be able to get that inside scoop and really look at, how people overcame the obstacles that were in front of them, it's very helpful, not only in terms of just kind of going like, oh, everyone is struggling with the same thing, others have had this struggle, but to get some examples about how to move forward, because, we want to really emphasize the positive experience of doing research and the excitement that comes from that. And the thing that came to my mind when you were talking about the kind of internalizing the questioning and tying it into creating your conceptual and theoretical frameworks and all of that is also kind of really internalizing that sense of inquiry and curiosity. So that, you're bringing that to your work, whether it is to human participants or to studies in the archives and documents, databases, or conducting other kinds of quantitative studies. Are there any other points from chapter 3 that you want to emphasize?
Lisa, do you
think-
have anything?
I think we should mention the very common question we get when we teach this stuff to master students and also doctoral students, especially when it relates to quantitative studies, where there seems to be this assumption that you have to use hypotheses if you do a quantitative study, that all research questions are structured as hypotheses if you do a quantitative study. And we don't agree. Like, you can do exploratory research as taking a quantitative approach, and that way you will explore what's going on in a population related to some variables that you're
Mhm.
interested in, but you have no like assumption about what's going on.
Mhm.
You want to know. You don't know enough yet to actually find a hypothesis. So you're doing this exploratory study to learn more or learn enough to maybe at later stage have your hypothesis about what's going on. And those studies are also quantitative, and they are worth doing, and they can have good designs, and everything can be, those can be really good quantitative studies. Because if you do use the hypothesis, you narrow your focus even more,
Mhm.
because then you narrow your focus to an assumption about what's going on in that population. So you start off by, I assume this is what's going on in relation to these specific variables in this specific population, and then you go out and test that assumption. So using a hypothesis is even more narrow than designing explorative quantitative studies, which you can do.
And we even get the same question, Janet, even on a bigger scale of, does my research, not quantitative research, but does my research need a hypothesis? And the answer to that is, well, you need to tell me what your research question is and what your research problem is, et cetera, et cetera. Because Elise is making a really important point there, that hypothesis and quantitative research have become quite synonymous, and that's quite actually not quite correct, as she said. But equally, sometimes credibility, validity, these words are thrown around, authenticity, etc., can only be shown by using hypothesis-driven research. There is a certain way that is scientific, and there are other ways that are not. And that is exactly where we're going to move into methodology and explore in the next chapter. Like, where do these assumptions come from? Where do these types of questions come from? What are their basic beliefs, their inquiry paradigms when they're talking about research needs a hypothesis? So that one will be a lively discussion, because then we're starting to get into some of the big debates, right, about how one judges whether research is worthy or better, or who says. And it all goes back to the question and the work that goes into refining what you want to know about, and to answer what you want to know about, what type of knowledge will you need? Will it be quantitative? Will it be qualitative data? Will it be a certain type of quantitative or qualitative data, etc.? So for us, chapter 2 on ethics, because again, a research question is no good if it's not ethical. It can be beautifully structured or whatever, but if it's not ethical, if the research shouldn't be done, then it's not a good research question. Chapter 2 and chapter 3 to us are absolute foundational chapters. The emphasis on the idea of the research question and how it links to, as you so aptly put it, to all the other conceptual parts of the research design, and the ethics of the research, not just the ethics committee approval, but the ethics of the research, right from what is my question? Is this something that should be done? Is this question, even if it's really good, feasible to do, because that's an ethical question, etc., etc. So we're beginning to see this whole idea of this research design as this deeply interconnected area of facets that we're constantly revisiting and revisiting and revisiting as we think our way through our designing.
Well, we hope that this has sparked the curiosity and interest for our viewers, and you can stay tuned to see the coming chapters profiled and dig a little bit more deeply into the next stages of the research. So thank you for taking the time to explain these tricky kind of concepts for our viewers, and we'll carry on with our discussion of chapter 4 next.
We will. Thank you.